Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. Hey, fitness fanatics, welcome once again to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Welcome. Nora, how are you doing this morning?
Quite well, thank you. Got involved in a little project and I'm showing up, but I'm ready to go.
Last minute, I'm here.
How are you doing?
Very good. Based on response from last week, I thought, why don't we sort of take a step in the direction that we sort of talked about last week when we were discussing things. We're going to get into more about cueing today and talk about that, because I find that it's something that everybody thinks they know how to do properly. And I find until you've been in the industry for many, many, many years, you may not really understand the reasons why we're doing it, how we're doing it. And, we also, I think, get into ruts on, we say the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, how many times have you heard put your shoulders in your back pockets or, shoulders out of the ears and things like that? But what do the clients hear?
What do they hear and how do they hear it? And a lot of it for me is with any cueing that you're doing, whatever version, whatever words, whatever movements you're making, it's always about, is it landing? Mm-hmm. Right? It's what you're saying actually being taken and making the change that you want to make in that body. Sometimes I hear people cue and they're just cueing and they're saying their spiel, and the body in front of them is not necessarily responding to what they're saying, but they've just got their they're push themselves on automatic a little bit, and they're just saying their spiel and saying the words they usually say, but they're not necessarily waiting for that feedback back. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the really important things about cueing is effective when it's effective.
I find that in group exercise, I see a lot of people who go into, like you said, their spiel. They're on autopilot. They say the same things because they need to in a room full of 10, 20, 30, 40 people. They're going to say the same things over and over again to a certain degree because they're just trying to remind everybody, and they're trying to hit as many people. It's almost a shotgun effect, to try and get as many people at one time, because they can't do individual the same way we can as one-on-one instructors.
Yeah.
And I find that those group instructors do, when they make the transition to one-on-one, they have their patter and you can hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. One of the things that is true about that too is whether you're doing a group X or you're doing one-on-one or small groups, whatever you're doing, there's also that you have to teach them your language. Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of times I find that the repetition of group exercise is trying to get everybody thinking that this means this, go right, go left, go up, go down, increasing, whatever it is, whatever the cueing is that you're doing, helping people to understand what your language is and what you mean by what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Right. So some repetition of cues is useful as long as that client knows that when you say lower your shoulders or, lift your back up, what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When I find that when I'm doing a new client, for instance, they don't know my language yet. They don't know what I mean by certain things. So for me, I remember way back when, right when I was an infant in this industry, my mom had gotten injured. And because she tore her ACL, she was having to have surgery. She literally told me, I've got 3 days to turn you into a personal trainer and Group X instructor, or I may lose my business. And I took on the challenge. I'm a male. I'm early 20s, and I'm working primarily now with females, and I'm scared to death to touch them. My hands, it's like I can't, like they're lava. I am so far away from wanting to. And finally, because my mom was trying to get me, she was, just put your hands on her. I was like, yes, ma'am. And it wasn't until I had that permission in my mind that I was like, oh, okay. And she taught me there's a correct way to use touch, that you can move someone correctly in the right way And once I learned that, I found that I don't have to always use that touch because I can, say the words, use the touch, they can feel it. And it's like, oh, okay, I now feel that, they feel it and they know they have my definition for what that is.
Right. So those words meant that touch, meant that feeling, and they could connect the words to the feeling without having to do the touch.
Yes.
Right. Which is what so much of cueing is about, is what kind of shorthand or what kind of, usually auditory, but it can be visual or other kind of cues you use that produce the response that you want in that body, and then help that body understand, again, what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we were briefly discussing what we were going to talk about before we went on the air today. And what I had written down was I sort of always go back to styles of learning. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times I find that, and this is very true for people who have multiple children or have ever taught in a environment where you're teaching a bunch of different people respond differently to whether it be auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. And as I told you, I think we all learn through all of those ways, but we may learn through one a little stronger than the other. As I said, I'm very auditory. I can hear something, I can imagine it, I can picture it, and I can usually make it work. That could be from years on the radio or whatnot, or just listening and sort of having that imagination. But I also know I'll own it when I do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I've performed it, yeah.
I think in terms of movement, what we're trying to get is a kinesthetic response. Right, we're trying to get kinesthetic awareness to improve. I mean, body-mind connection, where your body is, proprioception, control, whatever your word is. That's where we're trying to get. We're trying to achieve improvement in kinesthetic awareness of what you're trying to do. Right, and some people get that through watching. Although, bringing that back to learning styles, I read something a long time ago, which has proven to be true in my experience, that very few people learn movement purely visually, unless they've been trained in it. So for example, one of the things I always say is, if you're a dancer and you've been dancing for the last 10 or 15 years of your life, and you've spent, many hours a week in a dance studio learning movement visually, primarily, you tend to be reasonable at it at a certain point, like that can work for you. But one of the things that new teachers often do, at least in the Pilates environment, is say, let me show you this exercise. They'll get down on the reformer, they'll show the exercise, and then they'll stand up and say, your turn. The client looks at them like, what am I supposed to do? That happened so many times when I was a baby teacher that I quickly learned most people do not take in information by watching movement visually.
Yep.
Right? Unless they've been trained to do that.
Yep.
And most people have not. So that was one of those good lessons for me.
Absolutely. And if you're a dancer, you may be able to watch a choreographer do something and be able to mimic it to a certain degree. If you're a trained dancer or something.
Yeah.
Because that's your gig. You've learned how to do that. You've learned how to take that information in visually and say, oh, okay, do that. And that's, you're going to be able to roughly do whatever it is they want you to do. Whereas I think for most people, they've never been asked to do anything like that before. And it's such a skill set that it's really a challenge to just tell someone to do something like the hundreds, for instance, where you're in a supine position, you're in neck flexion, for a little bit of forward flexion. Your arms are going to be what looks like they're just waving around like, a wounded duck, with your
flapping in the breeze,
with your legs extended out. And for a lot of people, they're going to, you want me to do what? Because again, they watch you do it for a second. You're like, okay. But they need to be able to feel it. And they sometimes need our hands to be able to put them in the proper position, to lift their legs to the right space, to lift their head, put wherever we need them to be. And then they can feel it, anchor it, and then hopefully reproduce it in the future.
And then using whatever words you want to try to reinforce those sensations. Right. So lower your legs only as far as you can without letting your low back pop off the mat, or whatever it is.
Right.
Lift your head, trying to lift your head from your sternum instead of just, straining your neck. Whatever those cues are, to try to have them have the experience. And then these are the words that go with that experience.
Right.
And this is what I mean by lift your head. This is how I want you to lift your head. This is where I want you to put your legs for these exercises.
Absolutely. And you just said a great one. Lift your head from the sternum rather than just lifting your head from the neck. you say that to a general person, they're going to say, excuse me, what are you talking
Where's my
about?
sternum? What are you talking about?
Exactly. That for another person, you may need to have another cue. And for another person, you may need to have another cue. And we've talked about this before, having 1,001 cues that mean the same thing, and just hope you hit on the right one for the client in front of you.
Yep. It's that shotgun approach. It's also having 100 ways to say the same thing.
Absolutely.
Especially key things you have to say a lot of times. Because the other thing too, so let's actually get back to that example and think about lifting the head, right? In personal training, in Pilates, we will often ask clients to do a curl, do a crunch, something, lift their head up off the floor for some reason, hands behind their head or not, depending on the circumstance. And so many elements of that are problematic, right? For a lot of clients, they're going to push their head forward, right? Just like they're pushing their head up toward the ceiling.
Yep.
For other clients, they're going to really strain the front of their neck, try to lift just up their head. Other ones will actually try to fold in their, round their thorax, if you will, or round their upper back and try to lift their head up that way. And we've got to be able to cue all of those things efficiently, because if I had to talk through every piece of that, it would take me 20 minutes to get through every exercise. So creating that shorthand in terms of cueing, effective shorthand is a lot of what we're looking for as well.
Absolutely. And that's why when you said that one, that is one that I still work on to this day, because it is so difficult to tell someone how to lift their head up off the mat, because I deal with a lot with clients who are older. They may not have very strong, cervical muscles to begin with, especially the deep cervical flexors or whatnot. So they have a hard time just finding the right position, and they almost always try and strain. So they sort of jut their head forward, they protract, they're leading with their chin. I've had some people say, well, feel like you have an orange or an apple under your chin as you curl up. And I'm like, well, that's fine, but then do they crunch it down? There's so many different ways that they can do that exercise wrong. That really getting them to do it properly is a challenge. And you really need to have a ton of ways to be able to say it. And then sometimes it just helps to take them in your hand and then put them in the right position and maybe cue gently. I find that tapping on the muscle that I want to start working wakes it up sometimes. So I say, I want you to use more of here, touching that area. They go, oh, okay. That way they're not straining their occipitals. They're not straining the back of their neck trying to lift their head up because they're in protraction. They're like, oh, these muscles. I got it. So sometimes that can work too.
And that gets to something that I often think about with cueing is oftentimes the first step on cueing, and I find, again, new teachers sometimes miss this critical piece, is what do I want the body part to do? Right? Which is often, sometimes they go straight for imagery or they go straight for something else. It's like, no, what do you want the body part to do? But this particular discussion brings us to that critical point of lift your head is what we want them to do, right? Lift your head. But how you do that and the ways you need to do that, that's not a straightforward way to say something, right? If I say lift your head, I will not necessarily get the experience that I want that client to have out of that cue. So that's where there's the just what do you want the body part to do, which is always fundamental, kind of where do I want the body going? But then it's how do you get it to do it correctly? And that's what I often think of as 2 layers of cueing.
Yeah. And everybody has their own mindset on how an exercise should be anyway, because
absolutely.
I find there are a lot of, and not to be stereotypical, but a lot of men who have done some training in the past. Let's say they're in their 40s now, but in their 20s, they lifted a lot of weights and they were in good shape. Well, they're coming to the gym with all of those old mindsets and old programming and teaching them how to do something properly now that their body is a whole lot different than it was when it was 20. Their mind, they're doing one thing, even though my eyes are seeing something completely different. So there's a disconnect.
Right.
That sometimes even having them look in the mirror, they still think they're doing it right. And you're thinking, wow, that squat does not look like a squat at all. Okay. This is an injury waiting to happen. Okay, we need to reinvent this. We need to reteach this. And sometimes it is trying to reteach those exercises because of what they have in their head. They have a mindset that this is what it's supposed to be. And a great example of this is my women who took for years and years group exercise classes, that every time they did a squat, they had to stick their butt back. And when they stood up, they had to tuck their tailbone under. And to reteach that is a challenge sometimes because that's what they learned doing aerobics for years.
I worked a lot with dancers who, have a very similar habit in some ways, although they never stick their butt out if they can help it. And I think what's interesting there is you've got somebody who has a motor pattern that is pretty deeply ingrained and that they think is correct, right? So their body and their brain and their mind and body and their spirit all say this is the right way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often found in retraining that I have to go. I can't often directly say this is wrong. We're going to do it differently. Like I often find I have to find I call it like the back way into that, change the position. So if it's a squat that's a problem, I'll take them into footwork on the reformer because it's a squat turned 90 degrees basically. Or I'll take them into some related exercise, something where I can get the mechanics in there and then I'll move it back to the squat.
Okay. Yep.
Right. Just that strategy of how do you retrain something when really it's pretty stuck in somebody's mind and body. And not just stuck in it, because I've got clients who are flexible on that and I've got clients who are not flexible on that.
Yes.
I think about, one dancer I had who was very posteriorly tilted, really pushing her femurs forward when she stood up, and she had a big butt. And a lot of that was trying to get rid of her butt because that's a typical dancer problem. And she had a lot of anterior hip pain because really she was stressing her anterior hip every time she stood up and pressed her hips forward. But getting her to actually bring her femur into a neutral position was going against everything she thought she was supposed to do for the last 20 years of her life.
Yep.
And it was really, I had to go very, very slowly in helping her to change that pattern.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think most of us have had, those clients who always revert back to that, whatever was programmed for so many years.
Yeah.
I've worked with some former powerlifters and things like that, and trying to reteach something that's been ingrained through thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitions, which got them to where they were. So they were relatively successful. But to take that next step, they have to make a change. It's almost like telling a golfer. I mean, you can remember the great story of Tiger Woods. He was unbelievable. And then all of a sudden he had a year where he was faltering. And this was in the middle of his career. And it's because he changed his swing. And everybody's like, what are you doing? Are you out of your mind? He's like, well, I want to get better. In order to get better, I have to make significant changes. And when he did become better, but he had that year that was really a challenge.
Right.
And it was sort of, why would you mess with something that was so perfect for so long? Well, he saw that he could get better. And when we're working with clients who have been thousands and thousands of repetitions and we're trying to teach them something different that is going to be hopefully safer, better, more efficient, whatever you want to use, I think that's sort of our goal. And it can be a very big challenge.
And something you need to approach slowly.
Yes.
Right? Sort of slowly and gently and work your way into it. In terms of how do you use language? Let's talk about language and cueing. Where do you, what kind of language do you use? What different techniques do you kind of think of verbally or to use verbally when you're teaching somebody?
A lot of times for me, I tell it through a picture. I have them imagine something a lot of times. So instead of just saying squeeze your shoulder blades together, I'll say something like widen your collarbones. It's the same thing, but it may take them from the thought of squeezing to the thought of lengthening. So a lot of people, when they do just squeeze the shoulder blades together, what happens? They shrug up. They get their upper trapezius involved. If they've already got a forward head carriage, maybe the levator scap gets angry. There's a lot of other things that go along with that. And I don't want to say, pull your shoulders out of your ears, because if you depress it too much and don't elevate when you need to, it can cause other problems. So I try and figure, okay, what's another way I can say this? And, so I'll say widen open your collarbones. widen your collarbones. But we also have some clients, and I'm thinking of one person in particular who was, she had a pretty significant eating disorder. The word widen scared her. That was a trigger for her. So I had to make sure I used the word open. Open your collarbones. She responded to that word. If I said widen, I could literally see her shut down visually. I could see it in her eyes and everything. She began to shut down. So for me, it was finding the right cue for that person by saying the same thing. You know, but again, when it comes to language, I try and paint the picture for them so they can feel opening that collarbone. They can see it opening wide. And it's like, oh, and they get it and they feel it and they're saying, oh, I got this. Whereas, again, squeeze your shoulder blades may or may not work. And I'll use that for some people if that's what I'm looking for. But a lot of times I try and sort of sneak it in the back door as well by doing that visual cue as well, or painting the picture, I should say.
Nice. Yeah, painting the picture. Finding the place to do the cue from. You know, do you want to lengthen here? Do you want to tighten there? Because typically, you know, if you're moving something, something's getting loose, something's getting tighter.
Exactly.
So do you cue it from the action side? Do you cue it from the release side or the concentric, eccentric side? Interesting.
Something else to think that just to go along with that, sometimes with painting the picture, it also goes into sort of imagination where, and I think I used this in our last episode, cueing the lower abdominals. You know, for years I kept hearing people say, make them smile, and I never got it. I didn't understand it. And it wasn't until someone told me, imagine them as elevator doors, and I want you to shut the elevator doors. That visual picture in my brain was like, oh, I can do that. And I started using that with clients, and it worked for some clients. Making them smile worked for other clients. Okay. So again, having multiple ways of saying it and doing it when I was asking for a contraction, but I wasn't asking for them just to brace.
Right.
It was really, you know, saying, okay, below your belly button from one hip bone to the other hip bone, I want you to imagine elevator doors and just gently close those. And you could see them, their transverse abdominis began to contract. You could see it visually. I was like, oh, okay, that works. So it's not just the eccentric, but also the concentric, like you said. You can do it from both sides, the shortening or the lengthening.
And to your point there, it's looking at what happened to the client.
Yes.
Right? It's like, did you get the response you wanted from the cue you gave? I've had more than one time when I've watched a client, I've watched a teacher just keep giving the same cue to the client who's still not getting it. You know, it's like, drop your heels, drop your heels, drop your heels, drop your heels. Like, you've got to find some other way to say that because it's clearly not getting through.
Yep.
And, you know, then the teacher's getting frustrated, the client's getting frustrated, things are not working. So that's where having many ways, so thinking about different body parts, thinking about images and having multiple images for it. And then noticing, like, some of my clients, I'm thinking of a couple of men I worked with, could not stand, like one of our teachers was very flowery in her imagery. And it drove them nuts. I could see that when they're going off about imagine butterflies floating, but they were just like totally tune out.
Absolutely.
You know, they just could not deal. They're like, just tell me where my shoulders need to go. Like, just give me the facts, man. And was watching that interaction happening. I learned a lot about, okay, so you've really got to look and see what cueing do they respond to? What are they an imagery person? Are they a mechanical person? One other thing that I wanted to bring up here is I've had a couple of different clients, and I worked for a long time in the Bay Area, so I had a lot of tech people that I was working with, engineers and stuff. And sometimes, and I'm thinking of two clients specifically, one of them had to know every possible reason why I was giving her the cue I was giving her and what that would mean in her like entire future life. Literally, if I couldn't kind of cite chapter and verse of all the studies that meant that your pelvis should be in this position when you're doing this exercise, she literally wouldn't believe me.
Yep.
She literally can look at me like, okay, I'm not going to do what you say because I don't believe you.
Yep.
And she was, you know, and then I had another gal who questioned every single thing I said.
Yep.
no matter what I said. Like I could say lie down, and she'd say, "Why do you want me to lie down?" So it got really, and I couldn't give her any reasons for things. Like I could actually give her direct commands, like lie down, put your feet on the foot bar, straighten your legs. I could do that. If I said anything else, like imagine you're externally rotating your femurs, or take your feet and shift the weight to the. She'd say why, and we'd have to stop and discuss why, and would break the flow of the entire session. So with her, I really learned like I have to just give her the next movement, period. No commentary. That was the only way I could get through a session of more than like 3 exercises.
Yep.
So those are some interesting challenges as well.
I have so many clients that fall under those. Those are 2 categories that we have certain clients that we have shorthand with.
Yes.
And when I have a new client come in, I'll say engineer. My engineer people are the ones who need to know if you say, okay, I want you to stand with your feet shoulder width apart. And they say, well, is that 12 inches? Is that 13 inches? And
right.
It's like,
or is it this shoulder width? Is it inside of my shoulders or outside of my shoulders?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, just shut up and just do the exercise. Because I'll have them lean against the wall. Well, my feet are away from the wall. Now, are my knees exactly at 90 degrees? I'm thinking, are you bringing out a protractor? Are you going to be drawing with a compass here? And there are those people. So I'll tell my staff and I'll say engineer, and you can just see the look in their eyes. They roll their eyes going, oh no, not another one. It's like, well, that's how their brain works. And we have to find a shorthand that's going to work on their brain. We have the others, like, you said, the Y client. I have a number of that we call the Y. I say it's a Y client, and you can just see they'll roll their eyes again. Okay, and they'll know that they have to over-explain every exercise. And a lot of times how I get through that is I'll tell them just start, and I'll keep talking. And I'll explain the why.
Yes,
but
as they're moving.
As they're moving, and I'll say, keep going, like a march. I'll say, okay, march, why are we doing this? I say, keep going. Now, the reason we're doing this, keep going. Now, shift your weight here. Now, and I'll explain. But they'll do it for the same exercise week after week. So they're not really listening. They think they want to know. I think it's just that they have a curiosity. And I think some people need to be proven that you need to prove that you know what you're doing and what you're talking about. And that in order for them to trust or whatever, I think there's some level of that for some people.
So that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about this, but sometimes too, it's that they need to have. I'm going to take 2 different approaches to this because I don't really know. It depends on which particular client I'm thinking of. But if they're not particularly comfortable in their body, which a lot of clients are not, especially if there's pain or discomfort or other kinds of issues, or if there's other reasons why they're not comfortable with their body, they often don't really want to be there. And I find oftentimes a way to not be there is to keep talking.
Yes.
Right? I mean, whether you're talking and engaging their mind so their body can just kind of do automatically what it's doing, or whether they're talking because they don't really want to quite be present with what's happening.
Yeah.
And I find that's just another personality issue that comes up on either side. Some clients need to have the auditory something going on. It's like people who need to work in a busy coffee shop with their laptops. They just need that kind of stimulation around in order to focus, or in order to be present, or maybe in order to not be present, depending on the situation.
Yeah. I was having a talk with a client yesterday, and she was talking about a friend of hers. And I actually said this, I said, well, there are some people who don't feel comfortable in silence and have to fill every moment of silence with talk. And she said, yeah, like me. And I didn't want to say it, but in my brain, I was thinking, yep. And there are those people that they need to have that stimulation, that conversation. And for this person in particular, it is to get them out of their body because they don't want to be in their body for whatever reason. And if they're talking or they're conversing, they can step out of their body for a moment. And as long as they're doing the exercises correctly, I don't care half the time, because it's like, look, you're doing it properly. I'm happy. I'd rather you be focused, but I'd rather you do the exercises. So sometimes you just have to, give them a little.
Yeah, which is interesting in those circumstances because, with clients like that, I often have to, just like you, to get them started on something that I know they can do safely whether they're paying attention or not, right? So I have to really choose my programming in such a way that it's either not going to really require them to pay that much attention so they can talk through it. I just have to make some specific choices that way. But then watching them do that and still trying to throw a cue in here and there, just even in the midst of their conversation, hey, think about your left foot, or put a little more weight on your right side, or whatever it is, and just putting those into the conversation.
Yep.
And trying to keep them organized as they go.
Something I want to throw in here that I make mention to my staff, and I've done this for years. We have trainers who, when they first start, they don't say a word practically to the client. They are so focused. And they're almost hyper-focused that the client will come to me afterward and said, I don't think they like me because they didn't say anything. Whereas when I've worked with them, I've been at this 30 years. I mean, I can have a conversation and in the middle of a sentence say, put your weight through here, I want you to, and then go right back to the conversation because the conversation is on the back burner in my brain. What I'm seeing is on the front burner, but I can keep a conversation going, and newer trainers don't know how to do that. Right. I do find that flips a little bit when the client gets comfortable with the client, and then the conversation becomes more important than the exercise.
Yes.
And that client now is doing 87 repetitions because you're in the midst of a story and you have to remind the trainer, hey, let's story number 2, workout number 1. So there are those as well that we have to sometimes pull back and remind ourselves that what are they really here for?
What's the priority?
What's the priority? And to get them locked in on that. And to be able to say, yes, you need to be able to get them with the cueing as quickly as possible into the right thing. And I'm going to actually put you on the hot seat a little bit here, or shine a light on you, because you taught me once in a class, and one of the first things I ever did with you, it was in Denver, Colorado. We were at a POT. It was a Coraline class. And I was there actually with my mother. We were learning all about the Coraline. And this was before I worked with you. And we had a lot of baby instructors, who were assisting you. And everybody had 2 people. And someone who had us was someone who will remain nameless, but was used to only working with high-level dancers. You look at me, I do not look like a high-level dancer. I don't move that way. And she was getting more and more and more frustrated, and she couldn't get me to do what she wanted me to do, which was simply to basically a lunge on it. It was just a hoof back and then down into, and she could not for the life of me get me to do it. Everything was wrong. You came over, and with a single cue, all you said was, keep your back foot straight. And everything else cleared up. And even she was amazed. She goes, wow. And that taught me that day, find the one cue that will correct the majority of the issue. It's not going to correct everything because there's too many things. But what's the single most important cue that you can find that will make things look better? And maybe for that day, that's good enough.
And so that talks about priority. That also talks about experience.
Yes.
Right? Because there's that place when you've been teaching a long time where you have oftentimes for me, it's an unconscious, intuitive sense of what the root of the problem is or where the root might be. So if I correct that, that will clear up more things than not. I remember watching Kathy Grant, who's one of the Pilates elders, teach. And she'd been teaching for 40 years and was one of the most dedicated, committed teachers I've ever worked with, honestly. And she would look at somebody, she would give one cue, one really simple cue, not complex, not nothing. And that body would change more than any body I've ever seen. And I watched her work several times, and it was always like, wow, she totally, she knows exactly what to say to make the most impact with a very simple change. And it was a model for me. It's been a model for me forever. And I certainly do not always achieve it. But this brings up another thing that I wanted to mention here, which is so much of cueing is, right, it's about communication. It's about how we connect with that person in front of us, how we create a shared language, a shared experience, how they learn to trust us, or, in the case of the wise and the engineers, maybe not so much, or 60% time. because it really is, communication is always a dance. It's always a partnership. It's always them saying something, you interpreting that, you saying something back, finding a language between you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you've had clients, I'm sure, for many, many, many years. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I've had clients for, the whole time I was in private practice,
Yep.
16 years. I had clients who stuck with me for the whole time. And that's because I would say we're both able to create that empathy and to create that connection.
Sure.
Which is where cueing is effective. Like you can have I think about a Pilates teacher training program that will remain nameless that basically says, these are the cues you use for this thing.
Mm-hmm.
These are the 4 cues you can use to test out for this thing. So they have like a whole set of specific cues for specific things. And for me, it's like, that just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, I'm going to say, lower your shoulders, or there's a lot of things I say a lot, but I've got to find many, many, many other ways to say that,
Mm-hmm.
because the cue is not the thing. It's the meaning of the cue, how it lands, and how that communication happens between you and that client. It's that agreement about what these things mean.
If you have that language and that shorthand, and you see this with couples all the time, how many times have you seen a couple give just a look and the shorthand is there? Well, It's the same thing with a client that I've been around for a long time. I can literally just touch their shoulder with one finger, and their posture, everything just changes because we have that shorthand from the last 15 years of being together. And that takes time to develop. That takes time to learn one another. And I also have some clients, and I want to get into touch in just a minute, where they'll tell me, please, I feel it so much more when you guide me with your hands, like for a row or something like that, to widen the shoulder blades and really get good retraction and to be in the right position. And I'm putting less than a pound of pressure. I'm guiding at the most.
Yeah.
But there's that trust that they know that they're doing it correctly, that they trust themselves because I'm putting them in, this box a little bit. And they'll say, please, I need your hands there. And I'll do it for 4 or 5 repetitions, then I'll let go. And I may come back, I may let go. But it is that shorthand that I know what that client needs.
And this gets to, yes, and touch is really interesting. And touch is something that I like to talk about a bit, especially in terms of cueing.
Yep.
Because one of the things there's several things I say about it. One is, some clients are just not comfortable with touch. I've had a couple of clients, not many, who are just like, don't touch me.
Yep.
Okay, fine, no problem. And I do tend to say, do you mind if I, cue you, or do you mind if I touch you? No, they're generally fine, but every now and then they're not. Having been particularly in the gyrotonic world, having done a lot of gyrotonic sessions, they do a lot of hands-on in that work, because they're trying to help you understand rotational patterns and lateral flexion patterns that are fairly complex.
Sure.
So the hands-on really helps you to understand, like, where is my body supposed to go in this action? Now, some of them know exactly what they're doing and can read the body, and the hands are exactly what you said, guiding that movement appropriately. Right? They're just giving my body enough input that it can then figure it out on its own. Other people are taking my body and shoving it in a position.
Yes.
Right? And it's like, and again, this is more in gyrotonic than in Pilates, but it's just how you touch is so critically important to that. And 2 things you said, and the key thing you said was guiding. Like all I'm trying to do when I touch a body is, number one, I have to know exactly what I'm trying to do with my touch. If I'm completely clear on my intention, then the client, it's usually seamless and everything works. If I am not 100% clear on my intention, like I'm a little fuzzy, I'm not really sure what I'm doing, then that hand just feels intrusive, because that hand brings confusion with it. It's getting a little subtle, but this really is how you experience it as a client. Another classic experience I see in the Pilates environment is there's an exercise called short spine, where the feet are in the straps and you're basically up in kind of a shoulder stand. And the instructor will have one hand on one foot. Now, you may not I'm not sure if you can picture this, you guys, but basically, if you have one hand on one foot, all the feedback is coming through one side of the body in
Yep.
a very weird, awkward, and not well grounded place. And it's like one of the things I say is if you can't touch both feet equally, don't touch either one.
Mm.
Because that feedback, especially on the feet, they're very strong proprioceptive feedback, right? You touch it, that sends all kinds of information into the body. If it's only getting that feedback on one side, the nervous system just goes, what in God's name are you asking me to do? Because the body responds to touch. The body's like, what does that touch mean? What am I supposed to do with that touch? And will respond whether you are conscious of what you're doing or not. So I just wanted to bring that kind of that intentionality up, that care up.
That is a word that I find is the most important for touch, is intention. When I first started teaching larger groups and things, people would always ask, because I would, in my demonstration, I would be touching certain things and moving, and I'd say, look, this is part of our job. There are ways that we can touch correctly that are not intrusive. Yes, you ask permission, but I'll be the first one to say, after I get to a certain level with a client, I don't ask anymore, because that's going to be half of the session of me saying, do you feel and finally they say, yes, just put your hands where they need to be.
Yeah.
But there's a way to do it. And a lot of times I use one finger and my thumb.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've done this in front of classes before, and usually I'll take one of the, better, looking instructors. I'll say, come up here, because this is someone who's been hit on before and all this kind of stuff. And I say, just all I want you to do is look out into the crowd, and I'll say, do you feel comfortable when I do this? And I'll tap their shoulder with just my middle finger, and they say, sure. And then I'll put my thumb and say, if I moved you like this, do you feel fine? And then I'll put my whole hand on the shoulder, and you can see their whole body tightens up. And then I do something. They don't know how I do it, but I put the wrong intention in my head.
Yeah.
And my hand is flat, and I put the wrong intention. You can feel them squirm away.
Yeah.
Intention is something that is on a level that we don't, it's not necessarily verbal. It's just there.
Mm-hmm. It's
and
energetic,
you can
or whatever
feel
that
it.
is. Absolutely.
And I say, look, your intention has everything to do with it. You are there to help them. You are not there to do anything incorrectly or improper. If they feel that your intention is there to help, and you're doing it with a lighter touch where you're literally just doing the bare minimum to guide them into position, it works. It works. But I do see trainers who try and be a little too heavy-handed because they're afraid, especially the men, they're afraid of coming off as, hitting on the person or whatever, being inappropriate. So they almost do it a little too aggressively, because you can't take that aggression as, someone taking a pass on someone else. Whereas I say what we're doing is it's almost, I don't like to use the word necessarily medical, but it's definitely much more in a therapeutic healing sense to put your body in the right position and, allow them to guide them in that position, because now they can feel it better. Perfect. You do it a few times, you back off. I was having a little bit of an argument with a trainer, and I knew I wasn't going to change his mind. But he said, we never should touch a client. He said, I carry a stick or a ruler or something like that, and I can always touch them with that. That way I don't have to put my hands. And I said, and my thought was, if that's what makes you comfortable, fantastic. That's your technique. But he was teaching a lot of other people how to do that. And I'm thinking, I don't know about you, but my sense of tactile touch, I get a lot of proprioception from that, and I can feel what's working and what's not and how their body is moving through my fingertips. So to me, I need that, because that tells me a lot.
Now, just a caveat, because depending on where you are, scope of practice for
Absolutely.
personal trainers and Pilates teachers, there are all kinds of rules about touch and not touch. So
that's true.
I just want to bring that up there as a caveat here.
Absolutely.
But within that, many of us, regardless of what's happening out there, will put hands on a client because that's necessary. One story I sometimes tell here, and this is embarrassing for me, but I like to say it, is when I was a baby teacher, I had one client, who's a male client, who was very attractive. And it was one of those things where, usually I would just use my hands as I do. I knew that my intention with my hands on that client was not appropriate. Like I knew I had mixed feelings in there. And it was one of those things like, okay, I'm just not going to touch that client.
Yeah.
So it's also that self-awareness of what is my intention here? Is it clean? That's the only time that's ever happened. Usually it's like, it is clean. But that one time was like, my intention is not clean here.
Mm-hmm.
One other time I was really, really frustrated with a client. They just were trying my patience in that particular day. And I knew that if I touched them, that would come through.
Sure.
Right. That I was just too aggravated with them for a variety of reasons to be able to touch them cleanly. And that day, it's like, I am not going to get my hands on them because what will come through is, you're an idiot. Why are you, like something would come through that was not helpful for the circumstance. So again, that's just getting back to that intention. What is that intention?
Interesting.
And again, a light touch with strong intention is all you need.
Yep.
Finger on the shoulder, relax the shoulder. Oftentimes I'll help people with rotation by just very gently helping them feel the ribs rotate, right? Yep. Very, very light touch. And that makes all the difference.
All the difference. All the difference. And I've had numerous clients say they feel it's so much better and so much more with that.
Yeah.
And like I say, I've had so many of them who will say, no, I want you to put me in the right position. I respond well to that. But like you said, there are a few. And this comes back to something that I realized fairly early in my practice. I had a client that it was our first or second session, and I was doing a little bit more of an assessment with the person, and I needed to push inside and outside of their wrist, just to test their rotator cuff integrity. Just a little bit of light touch just to see if they had some integrity there. And as I did that, her whole body recoiled. And immediately I realized, okay, this is someone I'm not going to touch.
Yeah, exactly.
And it took me about a year before I felt and she felt comfortable with me doing just the bare minimum, because sometimes you just can't, they're not responding, that I'll say, do you mind? I just want to put your shoulders here. Hold it, this is the position we want. Okay, go ahead. But it took a long time for that trust to be established. And I realized that there was something in their past, for whatever reason, before me, none of my business. But I felt that energy change. And immediately I realized, no, I'm not going to.
Yeah, me too. I've had that a couple of times too. It's like, hands off.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's happening here. I'm not sure what just got communicated or what their response was, but this is not a person who's comfortable with this. Even if and sometimes they'll say they are.
Yes.
Right. Because I've had clients who are like, oh yeah, that's fine. But it's like, okay, yeah, that's fine. Like, okay, that's not fine. Right. and I won't do it. So I say, yeah, no problem. Right. They're just, you get that sense like, yeah, I'm being a good girl. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Rather than, yeah, that's fine. Right. Understanding too, just that reading a client, which is what all this is about, really.
Absolutely. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is for anybody who's listening to this who does work in an environment that has multiple people, multiple trainers, put it that way. Listen to what they say. Because I learned from my staff, because we all have our go-tos. We all have things that we've used 1,000 times, and they work on almost everybody. And if that one doesn't work, then it's this one, then it's this one, then it's this one. We have tons that we can use. But occasionally, I'll hear something, and I'll be like, ooh, that's good. And I'll go up to them later and say, I'm stealing that. I said, that's a fantastic cue.
We try to say, like, steal from the best.
Absolutely.
I said, give credit if necessary and steal from the best.
Absolutely. And when I take classes, I've learned, teaching, and I'll hear, the students, cueing each other. I'll be like, ooh, I like that one. And I'll say, that's a great cue. And I'll make sure I point it out in the class and say, this is a wonderful cue. Everybody listen to this. Give them the credit 100%. But in the back of my head, I'm like, ooh, I'm taking that. I know who I'm using that on.
Yeah.
So listening to other people cue, or if they're working with your body, what works with you that you're like, ooh, I kind of like that. That worked too.
Yep. Putting all those in your database.
Absolutely. Being open.
Yeah.
I find there are a lot of people who are very closed in their learning because they know it. They know it all. And my thing is the older I get, the more I realize I know very little. I am always learning. I have a lot of experience that's gotten me to where I am, but there is so much more for me to learn that I want to hear other people. I remember a friend of ours, Dallas, she cued somebody during one of our things, and I was her partner. I was like, oh, that's good. It was about thoracic rotation. I was like, I'm using you. Yeah, okay, all right. And it was just one of those things that I told her later, and she was like, oh, I've been using that for years. And I said, and yet I probably never would have thought of it myself.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
again,
Different brain, different body.
exactly. And different experiences. She's been teaching, as long as I have in another world, on another coast and everything. So you know what? She's had different bodies than I have, obviously. So it was a great experience. So I say, listen to how other people and see how they respond. If the person's responding well, ooh, that might work. So just be willing to, like you said, give credit, steal from the best,
It's also one of the biggest challenges I have with instructors who work by themselves, who have their own studio or a home studio and don't have any other instructors around them, and they say it too, they say, God, I get so stale, right? Because they just hear themselves talk and say the same 12 things to every client that walks in the door. And I'm like, yeah, you're the ones, those of you who are working, you guys out there who are working by yourselves, you're the ones who do need to go occasionally to a education event or a workshop or something, if for no other reason than just to hear other voices, other ways to say what you're doing, other ways to experience things, because that just keeps you open. And you're right. Like I think one of my, several of my students, but one of them accused me of having a very vivid imagination. Because
the accusation, the cheek.
I know, like the rudeness. Because I taught a reformer class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8:00 for years and years and years. And I had a similar group. The group rotated a bit, but I had a lot of the same players who would stay in that. And so, I felt like I had to find new exercises for them, new ways to say things, new ways to kind of wake up their nervous system. Because the other thing about cueing, right, is if you're saying the same cue you've said 100 times and you're not feeling it at the moment, talk about intention with touch. Intention with words is the same thing.
Sure.
Right? If you're just saying like, drop your shoulders, they'll hear it that way and it won't land. It's the same thing. And so for those guys, I would have to make up new cues and I would get a little wild sometimes, draw on popular culture, memes, and various different movies we'd all seen to try to get the point across. Again, to wake up the nervous system, to make them respond to the cue again. Because as you know, if you've been working with a client for a million years, they stop listening to you.
Yeah.
They really do. They stop hearing anything you're saying at a certain point.
Yep.
And those are the ones that say, oh gosh, this client, you leave for a week or 2 weeks and somebody else takes them. And that's the time when they come back and they say, oh, your trainer, Alice, gave me the best cue, da-da-da-da-da-da. And you're like, I think I've said that before. Like every week for the last 20 weeks,
18 times, yeah.
But they could hear it because a new voice said it, and that voice may have said it with more attention because they're new and they're trying to get it into you, right? They're trying to give you more of that attention and intention.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing that I think in wrapping this up, the one thing I want to sort of put out there, and I think there's a lot of things that we talked about that are very important. I think one is intention. What do you want them to do? Have an intention behind the words, behind the, whatever you're trying to do, whether it's visual, whether it's through touch, whether it's through auditory. What is your intention? And really make sure that they get that intention from you. I think that a lot of cueing, and it comes down to that communication, that you can communicate your intention to that person. And I think the other thing is, like you said, 1 million different cues to the same cue. A different version, many, many, many different versions to say the same thing, to say shoulders out of the ears. I mean, I've joked with people and say, okay, imagine that your shoulder and your ear just had an argument. They don't want to be around each other.
Right,
or
exactly.
they're magnets and they're opposites right now. Right now, the poles are
Yeah,
attracting. We don't want them to attract.
yeah, exactly,
Or,
exactly.
I don't know why your shoulder thinks your ear's so attractive today, but let's get them apart. I've used all of these things just to lighten the mood, to make people laugh, but it's all to say the same thing,
Yeah,
you know? And when you do that, and again, I use humor, but when you do that, it usually will wake them up and be like, oh, I got it. Uh-huh. And it may land differently each time. So I think those are two things that I would love, and I don't know if you have any final thoughts, for people to take away. Your intention behind your cue, and have 1,000 different ways to cue the same thing.
uh, to the second point, first point I think we've covered well. To the second point, one of my teachers who was very much very creative in her cueing always. She literally went through all of her Pilates manuals for every single exercise, and she wrote a whole bunch of different cues that she liked
Mm.
for that exercise. Like that was just her thing. She literally went through and added cueing or imagery or ideas or concepts to many of the key exercises because that helped her brain to stay
Mm-hmm.
alive. So especially those who've been teaching a long time, and you do feel like you're getting stale in your language, you need other ways to say things, or you're just feeling like you're saying the same thing, you don't believe it anymore. You take a moment, maybe think about several exercises you use a lot or several positions you use a lot, and just take a little list, take a moment and write down 3 images that come to you, or 3 cues that come to you, or 3 ways to think about that. And just to help yourself to find that curiosity, or, to your point, listen to your other teachers and say, oh, I want to steal that one. I want to steal that one, and start trying on some new cues, right? Just try on some new cues this week. Some will work, some won't, but just try some new things.
Yeah. Yeah. Expand a little bit, especially for those, like you
Yep.
said, who are solo practitioners, who don't get to
Yeah.
hear other people.
Yep.
No, that's great advice. Great advice. Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with everybody?
Cueing is about communication, it's about intention, it's about creating that connection.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to be a successful physical trainer of any kind, any modality, that is key. The teachers I know that have a million clients that will not leave them, or that their classes are always full, are those that create that connection. And they do it through communication, and they do it through that intention. And that's for me the key to being a successful trainer, really. You can be effective, you can be all those other things, but if you can't create that connection, you're not going to get where you want to go in terms of just success.
I couldn't agree more. I've had trainers that worked for me who are some of the best. They know what they're doing. They are fabulous, but they had no retention. And it's not that people didn't like them, they did, but they weren't as effective with their cueing. They weren't as effective as at getting their point across, at why are we doing this? So that's something else to think about. Make sure you have a why. Make sure you can get that why through your cueing to the client so they know
Yeah.
why they're doing
Yeah.
it.
Yep. Amen.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much for joining us. So I think we'll end it on that. You can check us out on our social medias. We've got Moving Combos on Instagram, and keep an eye on that. Keep a very close eye on that over the coming weeks. We're about to do something pretty cool here. So keep an eye on there. And Moving Combos, Facebook, movingcombos@gmail.com. If you want to get in touch with us, ask any questions, or have a topic that you'd like us to discuss. And we're going to be going out live and teaching all of this, live in studio. So if you're interested in that, reach out and we will make it happen. So
Bye, guys.
for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.